Okay. Figured out how to turn it on, I'll turn it right back off. Okay, let's see if we got it right this time. Yes, it does appear to be recording. So. It's great to be with you. I've had a chance to meet maybe a fourth of you. I look forward to meeting the rest of you at various times while I'm here. It's really wonderful to be up in the Northwest. I was here in 2012, I think it was. At that time, I had just had surgery. I have something called essential tremor. If you're old enough to know who Katharine Hepburn is, Katharine Hepburn was sort of the ultimate in essential tremor. So her hand shook, her head shook, and her voice shook. And all three of those shook on me. And what I had was called a deep brain surgery. They actually gave me a kind of pacemaker, and then wires go up through my neck and go down my head to some spot between my ears. And the electricity that comes out of the end of those wires stops my shaking, which is just tremendous. And I had just had that surgery, I think, and was in between. I had the surgery in December. They turned the equipment on February the 2nd, and the expositor seminar, I think, was in that slot in between. So I had not begun what I regard as my new life. My new life began on Groundhog's Day in 2012. They turned this machinery on, and all of that shaking stopped. So it's great to be back up here. Great to be here under better conditions. And great to be here in May on the east side of the mountain instead of in January on the west side of the mountain. The west side of the mountain was fine. It was a little cool. It was a little drizzly. This is wonderful weather here, and good opportunity to be with you. And I'm excited about what we're going to talk about because I've taught 1 Peter for a number of years. And so I'm very familiar with 1 Peter and was really pleased when Mark got in touch with me and said that the committee wanted me to talk about 1 Peter and the notion of holy living in an ungodly world, because they really hit the nail on the head as to what 1 Peter is about. 1 Peter is a situation in which Christians are living in the middle of ancient Asia Minor, which we today would know as Turkey. And in many of the areas there, they were living as a minority, and a minority that was persecuted and suffered. And we feel ourselves in the United States becoming more and more like them. So in this session, what we're going to talk about is Christians in ancient Asia Minor and modern America, but I want to reverse the order of that. I want us to talk about modern America first, and then move towards ancient Asia Minor. There's a growing sense, and I know it has hit the Northwest significantly earlier than it hit most of us in the South. I have been raised, by the way, just to let you know my background, I was raised in Georgia and Alabama, and I've spent the last 33 years in Tennessee. And so I'm Southern, very much a Southerner, very much raised and spent my life in the Bible Belt. And I'm aware that I'm in a completely different world. And glad to be in that world, and glad to interact with you and find out some of the things that are going on here. Recently, I was listening to, or actually reading an article by a man named Ed Stetzer. Ed Stetzer works for Lifeway, which is a Baptist organization. He works for Lifeway Research. And they do research in a number of areas over the years. And he said that most people think the United States is becoming more and more like Western Europe. That as far as the religious landscape, what you should do is look from the United States over to Western Europe and to where things are there, and we're heading that direction. And it surprised me to hear Stetzer say, I don't think that's correct. He said, I think there's wars and various aspects of the background that are taking place in Western Europe, that's not a good picture of where the U.S. is heading. He said, where I think the U.S. is heading is, and this will interest all of you, the Pacific Northwest. He said, look at the Pacific Northwest of the United States, and that's where the South and everybody else is going to be once you give us enough decades along the road. And so it's very interesting to me to come to the Pacific Northwest and for us to discuss these issues, because I realize that they have hit you harder and earlier than they're hitting the rest of us. We have a growing sense among conservative Christians in the United States that the U.S. is now a secular state, that Christians are becoming a minority, that we're entering what's often described as a post-Christian culture, and that we're involved in a culture war. Those are buzzwords that I am hearing more and more regularly. They're growing in the latter part of the 20th century, and now that we've gotten into the 21st century, you're hearing this language all the time about Christians becoming a minority, about us having a secular state, a post-Christian culture, and being engaged in a culture war. In fact, the language of culture war used to talk about Christianity and the difference between Christianity and the sort of growing secular state was popularized as early as 1991. I don't know if you've ever heard of this book, but James Davison Hunter wrote the book, and it's on your handout there, Culture Wars, The Struggle to Control the Family, Art, Education, Law, and Politics in America. And in that book, he talked about a wide variety of the views that we find that we are currently having culture wars about. He, of course, talked about abortion. He talked about various aspects of sexuality. He talked about various aspects of church and state and their relationship, and declared it all to be a kind of culture war. Now, as we go on and talk about this some more, I am aware and I'm kind of sympathetic with a number of conservative Christians who are moving kind of away from the language of culture war, because they think that us using that kind of language creates too much of a fight and warfare kind of mentality and doesn't help us to relate to the culture around us. And so even though we've used the language culture war a lot, I'm aware of and sympathetic with the fact that there are those who are calling for us to not that we're going to capitulate to what's going on in the culture around us, but that determining that this is a war and speaking of it in terms of constant battles and wars is perhaps not the best language for us to use and the best way for us to relate to the world around us. And I'm also aware, as I've already mentioned, of differences between my section of the country and this section of the country on issues like this one. In fact, and I don't know to what extent any of you are familiar with the Pew Trust research, and in 2008 and then again in 2014, they published a description of the religious landscape of the United States. Are any of you familiar with that? The Pew Trust, Religious Landscape of the United States? A few of you, probably the ones of you who are preaching, and others aren't. It's available, by the way, on the net. If you just Google Religious Landscape of the U.S. And Pew, which is P-E-W, you can find both the 2008 study and the 2014 study. They interviewed 35,000 people in the United States. It was extremely well funded, extremely accurate and well done survey across the states. And I wanted to look at just the statistics of what the differences are between Tennessee and the state of Washington. And so in Tennessee,
I have a feeling it's going to be different.
we are told that in Tennessee, 81% of the people surveyed claim to be Christians. In the state of Washington, now this is in the 2014 survey, 61% of the people surveyed claim to be Christians. Now many of those are what the surveyors would call legacy Christians or survey Christians. And that is, they were raised in a Christian family, they had some contact with Christianity, and when it comes to a survey and it says, what religion are you? They're going to put Christian, but it doesn't mean that they ever darkened the doors of the church. And so about 80% in Tennessee and about 60% in Washington. The other highest group is, well, let me mention the evangelicals among those first of all. And that is, they would consider churches of Christ to be evangelicals. Evangelicals is the terminology used for all conservative churches, as opposed to kind of mainline liberal churches, the churches that are appointing preachers that are in gay marriages and things like that. When we're talking about evangelical Christians in the state of Tennessee, that's 52% in 2014. In the state of Washington, that's 25% in 2014. So it is a very significant difference. So roughly you can remember these. It's 80% Christians, 60%, 80% in Tennessee, 60% in Washington, 50% of the total population say they're evangelical Christians in Tennessee, 25% in the state of Washington associate themselves with groups that would be called evangelical Christians. Then the other group that is the largest group, besides those who associate themselves with Christianity, are what they call the unaffiliated. Now the unaffiliated includes a small percentage of atheists and agnostics, which are 10% or under in both states, people who would declare themselves to be atheists or agnostics. But people who just declare themselves to be unaffiliated in the state of Tennessee is something like 14%. I meant to bring this with me. I have it right in my hand before me. In the state of Washington, it's 30%. So there's a significantly larger number of completely unaffiliated. I have no affiliation with any religion or any church in the state of Washington. So I'm aware that I'm really in a quite different world. And I'm kind of excited about being in that world because I want to interact with you and hear how you're handling aspects of that world that's becoming a more and more real world for all the rest of us. All of us see it going in that direction. I've never heard anybody but Ed Stetzer say, look to the Pacific Northwest and you'll see where we're going. But I think there's a lot of merits to that, from what I understand. Now, there have been various points at which conservative Christians have felt that we were becoming a secular state, that the secularization of America was increasing. And I've just identified a few of those points, and you'll be familiar with these, I think. One would be the Roe versus Wade decision in 1973. What was Roe v. Wade about? Anyone? Abortion. Yeah, so the abortion decision. It's hard to believe that it's been that long ago, but the basic abortion decision was made in 1973 and has held since then. Another is the rise of the new atheism. And you may or may not be familiar with the language, the new atheism. Atheists have been around for a long while. But after 9/11, and 9/11 is, according to many of the new atheists, kind of the point that brought out the new atheists. There became a new brand of atheists represented by Sam Harris is not the most famous. Who is the most famous of the new atheists?
Dawkins?
Yes, Richard Dawkins would be the most famous. Christopher Hitchens, who has died, would be another. Those three and one other guy call themselves the Four Horsemen of the Book of Revelation. and been called that by Christians, and they were happy to take that particular terminology for themselves. The difference in the new atheism and the old atheism is its aggression. The old atheism believed many of the same things. The new atheism is anti-Christian and is very adamant about how Christianity is contributing to the ills of society and not the betterment of society. And so they're very aggressively anti-Christian. You say, well, what does that have to do with 9/11? 9/11 was, of course, perpetrated by religious fanatics, Muslim religious fanatics. But the new atheists are anti-every religion, and they paint Christianity, in a sense, with the same brush that they paint Islam and radical Muslims, and they want to stomp out all religion, and they believe that all of it can ultimately lead to the kind of things that happened in 9/11. And so the new atheism has really stepped up their attack in the last 15 years since 9/11. And then for much of the country, and I know that this was not as big a deal in the state of Washington as it was in the state of Tennessee, but in the state of Tennessee, October 26, 2015, the SCOTUS decision, the Obergefell decision for gay marriages was just startling to all conservative Christians in the state of Tennessee. And the language about us entering a secular state, about there being a culture war, all of that kind of thing has heightened tremendously now in less than a year. And especially since here within the last few weeks or month, we have also seen, following right along behind that particular decision, not legislative decisions, but executive decisions coming primarily from the President concerning transgender restrooms, and that has become a big issue as well. And so all of this has seemed to many people in the Bible Belt to be marks of the notion that we are moving towards a more and more secular state, and a state that is less and less sympathetic with the interest of conservative Christians. So why is it hard to live a holy life in the world in which we find ourselves and the world in which we seems to be developing more and more of a secular attitude, and in some cases an aggressiveness towards conservative Christians? I've tried to put here on the sheet a list, and you may think of other things that ought to go on this list, of some of the things that are making it difficult for us to live holy lives before God. The first two items I've listed are heavily overlapping, and that is just the general narcissism and individualism of our culture. I see some of you thumbing around. You should have a document that says 1 Peter Holy Living and Ungodly Culture at the top. So we're going to have that. There's a couple of people that does it. We've got a couple of extra copies here. Yeah, Martin did just know.
Who does that?
Anybody else that doesn't? No, a third person doesn't. So. In their recent book, in fact, it's just come out within the last couple of months, entitled Good Faith by David Kinnaman and Gabe Lyons. I'm going to refer to this book several times, and I would really encourage you to think about getting and reading this book. David Kinnaman is the head of the Barna Institute. How many of you would know what the Barna Institute is? Okay, probably the majority. The Barna Institute does various kinds of research concerning religious issues. And there's a lot of publication of that kind of research here, but it's not just fundamentally a publication of research. It is rather trying to describe how we as Christians can live in a sense that people will look at Christians and say, that is good. How we can live a good faith in a growing antagonistic and growing ungodly culture. And they, in describing kind of the basic ethics and approach of our culture, they use the term meism. And that's what I am including by talking about narcissism and individualism. And that is the notion that ultimately the key deciding factors about what one does in one's life is to be decided on the basis of what seems to be the most self-fulfilling. By your own judgment, what is the most self-fulfilling and satisfying thing you can do in life? That is how we make determinations of what we ought to do, and not on some other basis. Consumerism. And of course, all of us that watch TV, listen to radio, read magazines, look at anything that's constantly supported by advertisement, are constantly influenced by consumerism. And if you haven't felt any struggle in your own heart with consumerism, you're not a normal American. Because virtually every American and every American conservative Christian struggles with consumerism. How much stuff is enough stuff? And we're constantly being told that you'll be happy if you have this car. You'll be happy if you have this. You'll be happy if you have that. We are constantly being sold the notion that more things is more happiness and more self-fulfillment. And to a certain extent, we obviously buy it. If we are pilgrims and exiles living as Christians in a foreign society, we're fairly wealthy, well-fed, well-taken care of pilgrims and exiles. And we bought into the consumerism issue pretty heavy. And consumerism is one of the things that makes it hard to be a faithful Christian. Then there's drug, alcohol, and marijuana. I mention that because, of course, here and in Colorado and many other places, and it'll be legal in all 50 states. Again, we're all headed this way. You guys just got there earlier. We're all going down the same road unless something, unless the statistics about higher deaths on the highways or something like that slows down some other states. We're all headed in the same direction. The abuse of drugs and addiction to drugs. If you watch TV lately, you have seen specials on the news in just the last couple of weeks about doctors prescribing too many oxycodones and other kind of pain relievers, and about those leading to an addiction epidemic. And in fact, I think this very week on CBS, every night, they're following the life of a young man who is hooked on heroin. And heroin is you often get into heroin from oxycodone. You start on oxycodone, and then you can't afford to keep getting your high that way, and then you eventually get into heroin. We, of course, live in a very violent society, and many of us as Christians watch extremely violent TV. You might just ask yourself, what is your measure of what's too violent? I have to say that there was a point at which I used to watch CSI on a fairly regular basis, and CSI finally went over the edge to me, and I cut the line off there. But hey, that doesn't make me holier than you, because there are other things I watch that involve violence. How much violence is too much violence in your exposure? And we're reaping that, of course, in our society. We're exposing people to violence all the time, and we're having violent acts in our schools and our shopping centers and our theaters and various places across the nation. Pornography. There's no way that I can be talking to a group of 40 or 50 men, and we do not have men here right now who are struggling with pornography. And part of the problem is, and I think about this with my grandchildren, and it just really upsets me, is that my grandson is going to carry access to pornography around in his pocket. Or he may just wear it on his wrist. Or by then they may have it implanted in his glasses or something like that. But my grandchildren are going to have such tremendous access to this. When I was a kid, in order to look at pornography, I had to sneak illegally into a store and find a time when the manager wasn't looking and pull it off the shelf and take a peek. That's not the way things are anymore. The way they are now is there's easy access to every person. Actually, the first time I was ever exposed to any pornography, I was in 5th grade riding my bicycle with a couple of other guys, and we came across a magazine somebody had discarded in the woods. That was the first time. But I didn't have this kind of access when I was a kid, and I'm thankful that it wasn't there when I was a teenager. But now everyone in this room knows that it's there. You have these computers, you have these telephones, it's there. The only thing that's going to stop you from accessing it is you. Or getting caught by somebody. And that person may have some influence on your life at that particular point. But we live in a world that is drenched in pornography. We live in a world that's drenched in promiscuity, in which sexual activity. I had a friend several years ago who got onto Craigslist to find a prostitute. And so he found this on, I don't know how you do that on Craigslist, but he found a connection on Craigslist. He went there to be with that prostitute, and the police were there. And so he got caught with what he was doing. But it's amazing to me that Craigslist could be used for that. I mean, ease of access now. You don't even have to go to a certain district in town and drive down the street looking for a prostitute that's out on the street. Gender confusion is an issue that we would not have thought much about 5 years ago. Anywhere, including the state of Washington, I assume you wouldn't have thought that much about gender confusion. You may have not had very much encounter with it yet. I've had a small amount, and in the question and answer session, if we want to talk about that, I'll talk about some of the ways in which I've had some contact with people who are confused about their gender. Flippant views of marriage, of course, have been around for a long time. And in every state in the Union, we have no-fault divorce. And there are many people, of course, who, as Seneca said about ancient society, marry to get divorced and get divorced to get married. And then intolerance of even diverse views on matters like contraception or abortion or LGBT concerns. I mentioned contraception in here, not because it's probably as big a concern in this room, but if we were a group of Catholics getting together, we would talk about how we had been persecuted for decades over our religious concerns about contraception. And even though your concerns might not be the same as your Catholic neighbor, the issues that you're having about your concerns are the same kinds of issues. It is a religious objection, and it's whether or not the state has the right to say, for example, if you're a Catholic insurance company, that you've got to cover something that you consider to be a violation of your conscience. And so contraception is a significant issue to a number of people. And then accusations that Christians are misogynist, what does misogynist mean? Yes, the Christians are anti-woman. The Christians are into the hatred and mistreatment of the feminine sex. The Christians are anti-Semitic. and Christians flaunt privilege. That is, that we have been in a privileged position for the majority of our national history, and that we're trying to flaunt and push our privilege on everyone else. These are some of the issues that we face as Christians living in an ungodly culture. And if you think of others, I'd be interested during our question and answer session in us talking a bit about that. I do think it's important that we guard against the possibility of overreacting here. And I'm not sure that I can tell you exactly where the line is between reacting properly to what's happening with the secularization of the United States and overreacting. But let me give you a few cautions that in various literature that I've read and things I've listened to have caused me a little bit of pause. One of them is from a man named John Dixon. John Dixon is part of a group called the Center for Public Christianity that's in Australia. Australia, as you may know, is an extremely secular place and has a very small percentage of Christians. Dixon said that according to surveys taken there, that there are 15% of Christians who attend church, and that is using the guideline that you've attended church once in the past month. So there are 15% of Australians who have attended church once in any given month, and a relatively small percentage of those are more evangelical or conservative Christians. And he said that he constantly hears language about it being a post-Christian culture. But he raised a little question about that and said, yes, it's a post-Christian culture on the one hand, but on the other, Christianity is still the most significant religion in our country. And it gets many times news coverage and things that others would not get. Buddhists would not get it. Muslims would not get it. Hindus would not get it. And the same thing is true here. I have used the language many times and probably will continue to use the language that we're living in what is becoming a post-Christian culture. And yet it was striking to me that the Pope came to the United States for 6 days, and every night on the evening news we heard at least 10 minutes of what the Pope did that day. Where he went, what he said, who he encountered. That would not happen to any visiting Hindu leader, any visiting Islamic leader, any visiting Buddhist leader. So there still is, we shouldn't think it is all over and it is a completely post-Christian culture in which Christianity gets no attention anymore. Secondly, I would say it has always been incorrect to describe the United States as a Christian nation. There was never an intention from the Founding Fathers to the present of it being a theocracy. It's never been a theocracy, never will be a theocracy, never has been a completely Christian nation. The decisions were not made on the basis of what does the Bible say, and that's how we'll set up the state. And so to say we've had a Christian nation all these years and we're going away from that is somewhat of a mistake, because it's never been from the beginning what one can call a Christian nation in a full sense. And then thirdly, I would also say that there are some things that have improved and have come closer to what God would want. There are aspects of our society that are more Christ-like. I was born in the 50s. And in the 50s, the restaurants that I went to in the South, and I suspect the same thing was true here, had no African Americans in them. And they had to use their own bathrooms, they had their own school system. There were all kinds of incredible things that were going on in our so-called Christian nation at that time that have vastly improved since then. And there are aspects of our world that we can look at and say, Well, things are more Christ-like in this respect or that respect. They are more as God would have them be. And so we shouldn't paint a totally bad picture of everything that's happened for the last 10 years, or the last 25 years, or the past 50 years in the United States and say in every single possible way we have been moving away from Christian values. Nevertheless, a shift has clearly been occurring. And especially in the 20th century, we are coming into a world that's very different than the world that I grew up in. And then looking out here, I can see that many of you who have gray hair grew up in the same world. That is, we grew up in a world in which Christians were called hypocrites and were criticized by neighbors, but the neighbors were glad to have them there. Even if you didn't want to be a Christian, you thought Christianity was a good thing. They built hospitals, they built schools, they fed the hungry, they healed the sick, they contributed to society, and it was a good thing. There were not many people in the 1950s and 60s and 70s that thought Christianity was a bad thing in and of itself and they'd like to get rid of it. That has changed and is changing more and more. And the new atheism may be the cutting edge of it, but there are more and more people that consider being a faithful Christian to be something that is extremist in and of itself. And that is a new world. If you want to call that a post-Christian world, a secular world, whatever you would like to call it, that is a change in our society. And so we live in a new and different world. I hope to go a little further, and we will in the next section. We will get into 1 Peter, because I want us to now take this world in which we live in and go to 1 Peter and ask what the world in 1 Peter was like in which those Christians lived. And we'll do that at the evening session. We'll take here about 10 minutes break, and then we'll have a Q&A time at about 2:30.